So I'm sure there are some parents here with full-grown children who are now adults who perhaps understand what it was like for your children to go through their teenage years. And if you're parents with children of that age, you'll probably remember what you were like as a teenager yourself. And if you are parents here with children yet to become teenagers, watch out. There's something about becoming a teenager which can be quite distressing for a family, but also for the young person themselves, probably more so. In the 90s, I don't know if you remember, anyone remember Harry Enfield, the comedy sketch show? He had one character who was probably the most famous called Kevin, and Kevin was a stroppy teenager. He's always given his parents a really hard time. But the very first episode where Kevin appeared, he was a bouncy 12-year-old. He loved his mum and dad, he had a nice haircut, he was well dressed, and it was on the eve of his 13th birthday. And as the clock struck 12 and he was dancing around, I can't wait for my birthday, struck midnight, and all of a sudden he fell to the floor. And you know, like when the werewolf changes, it's like, oh, this horrible thing happened. He gets up. He's a 13-year-old, he has long, lanky hair, he's got loose clothing, he's walking around like this, and so, I hate you, Mum, I hate you, Dad, you're always trying to control me, blah, 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 all that kind of thing. And that is often a phase we go through as a teenager. I think of some of the haircuts I had as a teenager trying to establish my own identity, and I cringe. My brother still teases me about it now. But it's also the most important phase of a young adult's life, because that's what it is. It's the becoming of a young adult. It's when a child becomes separate from their parents. They forge their own identity. They begin to recognize themselves as an individual. That's a natural thing to happen. It has to happen if a young person is going to become an adult. But it's very confusing because it's happening around all the bodily changes that happen at that time. So it can be a stressful time for a parent who is used to their child being their child, and a stressful time for a teenager who wants to break free from the all of a sudden oppressive bonds of the rules of the family. It's a necessary phase. Abraham, in the first reading, he goes through it with Isaac, perhaps in the most stark and vivid way imaginable, when he has to sacrifice his son Isaac. Sounds a bit brutal, but we'll get back to that and try to understand the background to this story. See, for some people it's hard to leave home, particularly these days when house prices are quite high. Often young adults can stay at home in their 20s, their 30s, even their 40s, never establishing their own identity. How old do you think Abraham was before he left home? He was 75. Imagine that, Imagine his mum, God bless her, still alive. When is this boy going to get a job, or move out? So he hears the call of God at the age of 75, and he goes. God says to him, go to a place that I will show you. And he plucks up the courage to break free from the bonds of home. He's been attached to his mother and father for so long, so it must have been so much harder to say, I'm going to make a life for myself. I'm going to follow God's calling, start my own family, and establish my own house and my own land. So he goes. But for him, as well as our generations today, if you want your life to live on, if you want your legacy to continue, you need children. And in the day itself, back then, especially a son who could carry the family name forward. And it was the one thing in his new life he did not have. He did not have a son. His wife Sarah was barren. And God kept promising him, though, I will make your descendants as many as the stars of the sky. And you can imagine Abraham, and he did it many often times. He's like, well, God, that's all well and good, but I don't have a son, so I trust you, but where's my son? And God eventually grants him a son, his blessed child, Isaac. Now, when Abraham is 99 years old, they must have had a good diet back then to live so long. God asks him to take his teenage son, the young man Isaac, and offer him as a sacrifice on the mountain of Moriah. Now, imagine the pain in Abraham's heart in having to do this, in having to follow this voice. How cruel must God seem in this episode? And it's one that scholars and theologians have struggled with for millennia. It just doesn't make sense. And yet on some level, it's a story that kind of resonates. It kind of hits my heart every time I read it. I wonder why. Let's try and read it in a different key and see if it makes sense. Imagine God is a faithful father, which we know he is. And he's trying to teach Abraham a lesson and to set Isaac free. He says to Abraham, offer me your son. Let go of him. Offer him in sacrifice to me. What he's saying to Abraham is this. You're clinging on to Isaac. You're holding him back. He needs to leave home. He is a young man. He needs to establish his own family. Remember the promise I made to you? Your descendants would be many as the stars. Do you want Isaac to stay home until he's 75 because he's so precious to you? Or do you want him to branch out, to establish his own life, find a wife and children, and, as I promised you, establish your descendants, as many as the stars in the sky? I think that's the lesson that God is trying to teach Abraham. So Abraham follows that voice. He is obedient. And the moment he raises the knife to slay his son, the angel calls out, or perhaps in another way, it dawns on Abraham, I know what I've been doing wrong. I've been holding on to Isaac. He was so precious to me because he was my only son that I was holding him in. He was mine. But I have to recognize that he is now a man and he is his own person and he must go out into the world. So in that one act, Abraham learned the meaning of fatherhood, and Isaac was set free to establish his own life. Now we see this in the reading, like if you read around the story, okay, because we have a kind of a summarized version here, when they were traveling up the mountain, Isaac asked Abraham, Father, where is the lamb that we're going to sacrifice? Because you went up on the mountain to sacrifice a lamb. That's why Jesus is the Lamb of God. And Abraham said, probably with his heart breaking inside of what he was about to do, God himself will provide the lamb, my son. And yet, when the angel calls Abraham off from this deed, the angel points to a ram trapped in a thicket and says, offer the ram in sacrifice. Now, what is a ram? It's a grown-up lamb. It's a fully developed, strong sheep. He was pointing to that ram and saying, this is your son. By this act, by letting him go, by giving him his freedom, he has become a ram, a man. He will establish your descendants. And this is what happens in the gospel today. Jesus is showing his disciples before his crucifixion what their destiny is, in a confusing and in a mysterious way. Before them, he is transfigured. He is showing them his full glory. He is showing them the consequence of holding nothing back, of sacrificing everything to God. And we hear it in the second reading. It says, since God did not spare his only son. Now, if you compare the original language of that reading to the original language of the sacrifice of Isaac, it's the same words. God is sacrificing his only son to set us free. But he shows us beforehand, because we may be afraid at the cost of the sacrifice, at the cost of the cross in our lives, what awaits us if we hold nothing back from him in our lives. You see, in this homily series we began last week, didn't we, talking about our need, if we are to be free, if we are to live as true Christians, as children of God, that we need to journey into the dark places of our souls, to let Jesus shine on them, to let the light of God shine on every area of our lives. And we may have said, okay, I'll do that. But how often in prayer do we say to God, and I'm talking about myself particularly as well, but I'm sure it's common to us all, we're praying away and we say things like, God, to you all the glory. I give you everything. And then a voice pops in the back of your head and says, what about that thing? What about that relationship that's not so good in your life? You know, that thing you really enjoy, but it's not so great. What about that addiction? What about that strife? You've got your own. I don't need to go on. What are you clinging on to? And then when you get to that bit in our prayer, we're like, I'll give you everything, Lord. Just not talk about that bit, that one. That's our Isaac, isn't it? That's our Abraham's Isaac. And God is asking the same question and making the same demand that he made of Abraham. I want you to sacrifice that to me. Not because I'm cruel, but because I'm a good father and I want to set you free. I want your soul to expand like the stars of the heaven, to shine brightly, not just for the paltry spell of life we have now, but to live on into eternity. I want your legacy to be not that which you held on to, but that which you set free. I want you to be like me, a loving father, a loving mother, a loving son who establishes the kingdom because I am in every part of your life. So that's the challenge for this week. We journeyed into the wilderness. Hopefully we're there. Hopefully our prayer is looking at those places that we'd rather not look at. But now let's journey to that place where that one thing, or maybe it's two things, who knows, that we're holding on to. Let's bring that out into the light. And like Abraham, but unlike Abraham, because he didn't know what was coming, because we know what awaits us if we offer everything in sacrifice to him. Let us offer that one thing in sacrifice to God, to pluck up the courage in the sure knowledge and the hope that what awaits us is not sadness, but freedom. Amen.